Pepi was only 6 years old when the palace swallowed him whole. The day his father's body was sealed within the pyramid, the air in Memphis felt heavy with dust and grief. The priests spoke in low, hollow voices, their linen robes glowing faintly in the torchlight. Pepi barely understood the words they chanted, but he understood one thing. Everyone's eyes were on him. The boy stood on a golden dais, small and narrow-shouldered, the heavy pectoral collar nearly swallowing his chest. The crook and flail were placed in his tiny hands. He tried to hold them the way he had seen his father hold them, but they felt alien, too large, as though they were mocking him. The high priest of Ptah raised his arms and shouted for silence. "Behold Pepi, son of Ra, Pharaoh of the two lands." The hall erupted in cries of obedience. Pepi felt his pulse quicken, a strange rush of power flooding his small frame. At that moment, he was no longer merely a boy. The kingdom was his, every servant, every stone, every grain of sand that touched the Nile. Yet behind the cheers, he saw faces watching him carefully. The viziers, the generals, the priests. Each one calculating, measuring, wondering how to mold this child ruler into their own image. That night, as the palace fell silent, Pepi wandered the corridors. The moonlight cut across the alabaster floors like silver blades. He stumbled upon a courtyard where slaves knelt, their backs streaked with fresh lash marks. The captain of the guard stood over them, whip still in hand, his face calm as if punishing them was no different from polishing his boots. Pepi froze. The sight was both horrifying and fascinating. "Why are they kneeling?" Pepi asked, his voice small but demanding. "They disobeyed the steward, Great One," the guard said, bowing slightly. Pepi stepped closer, peering at the men's eyes. They were wide, desperate, yet silent. It was the first time he had seen fear so raw and directed at him. He felt a chill down his spine, then something else, something warmer, an intoxicating sense that their pain meant he was obeyed. "Make them stand," Pepi said. The guard obeyed. The slaves trembled as they rose. Pepi's gaze lingered on them for a long moment. Then he nodded and walked away. He could still feel their fear behind him, following like a shadow. Over the next weeks, Pepi became a quick study in power. Vizier Harkuf, a man with a face carved like limestone and eyes sharp as flint, took charge of the boy's education. He taught him to read the sacred texts, to memorize the bloodlines of the gods, and, more importantly, to understand loyalty and betrayal. "The throne," Harkuf told him one evening, "is surrounded by vipers. Some will bow to you, some will smile at you, but their hearts are as sharp as knives. You must strike before they do." Pepi absorbed every word. He was no longer just a boy. He was learning to be a weapon. One evening, Pepi witnessed his first court trial. A servant had stolen a gold amulet from the temple. The punishment was to be severe. The accused was dragged into the hall, screaming and pleading. Pepi sat on the throne, his feet barely reaching the edge of the seat. The hall was filled with torchlight and the smell of incense. All eyes turned to him, awaiting his decision. His voice was soft, but it carried across the chamber. "Take him to the courtyard. Whip him until he can no longer stand." The order hung in the air like a blade. Pepi watched, heart pounding as guards dragged the man away. He didn't flinch when the screams echoed back into the hall. Instead, he felt an odd calm settle over him. That night, he could not sleep. He kept hearing the sound of the whip, kept seeing the faces of the slaves from the courtyard. And yet, instead of guilt, there was a dark exhilaration blooming inside him. He had given an order, and the world had obeyed. Pepi stood before a mirror, staring at his reflection. The boy who looked back at him no longer seemed entirely innocent. His eyes, once bright with childish curiosity, now gleamed with something colder. "This is what it means to be Pharaoh," he whispered to himself. And deep within the boy king's heart, the first seeds of his eventual madness took root. The weeks after Pepi's first judgment changed him in ways no tutor could teach. He no longer simply observed the palace, he inhabited it. Each hall, each courtyard, each column now felt like an extension of his will. When he walked through the great hall, the officials lowered their eyes until he passed, and the sound of their silence thrilled him. Vizier Harkuf watched with quiet satisfaction. "You are learning," he said one evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the Nile. The river glimmered under the moon, black and endless. But power must not only be learned, it must be displayed. Men obey only what they fear. That lesson came sooner than Pepi expected. One morning, the court gathered to settle a dispute between two high-ranking officials. Both were old men, proud and sharp-tongued, accusing one another of theft and betrayal. Pepi sat on the throne, the crook and flail across his knees, listening carefully. Their voices were loud, bitter. But beneath the argument, Pepi heard something else. Contempt. They were not afraid of him. They saw only a child playing king. When the last accusation was shouted, Pepi stood. The hall went quiet. "You are both guilty," Pepi said, his voice calm but cutting. "You have disrespected the court with your quarrel." Gasps rippled through the hall. The officials fell to their knees, begging for mercy. But Pepi did not waver. He turned to the guards. "Take them to the edge of the desert. Leave them there for the vultures." The sentence was carried out that same afternoon. Pepi did not go to watch, but he imagined it clearly. The sun beating down on the helpless men, the endless dunes stretching away, the circling birds. When news came that they had perished by nightfall, Pepi felt no regret. Instead, he felt a strange exhilaration, as though something deep within him had awakened. Word of the punishment spread through the palace like wildfire. No one raised their voice at court again. Soon, Pepi's curiosity began to grow darker. He wanted to know what fear truly looked like, not from a distance, but up close. He asked Harkov to show him the prison beneath the palace. The vizier hesitated, but he could not deny the boy king. The prison was damp and narrow, the air smelling of sweat and old blood. Prisoners huddled in corners, their faces hollow, eyes reflecting torchlight like frightened animals. Pepi moved among them silently, watching them flinch at his presence. One prisoner, a young scribe accused of blasphemy, lifted his head and spat at Pepi's feet. For a moment, time froze. Guards seized the man instantly, ready to cut him down, but Pepi raised his hand. "No," Pepi said softly. "Bring him to the courtyard at dawn." The following morning, the entire court assembled. The prisoner was dragged before them, still defiant. Pepi descended from the throne and stood so close he could see the man's cracked lips, the sweat on his brow. "You spat at your king," Pepi said, his voice almost gentle. "Do you regret it?" The prisoner said nothing. Pepi turned to the captain of the guard. "Do not kill him. Break him until he kneels." What followed was not quick. The guards worked methodically, their actions cruel but precise, ensuring the man lived through each punishment. The courtyard echoed with sounds that made even the seasoned soldiers pale. Yet Pepi stood still, watching every moment, his young face unreadable. Finally, after hours, the prisoner collapsed, whispering for forgiveness. Only then did Pepi raise his hand and end it. That night, Pepi could not sleep. He sat by the window, staring at the dark horizon. The screams from the courtyard still rang in his ears, but instead of haunting him, they thrilled him. He felt alive in a way he never had before. The throne no longer felt heavy. It felt like a crown of fire that burned away every trace of weakness. Vizier Harkov found him there at dawn. "You have done what most kings fear to do," Harkov said. "You have made the court tremble. They will not forget this day." Pepi smiled faintly, a strange glint in his eye. "Good," he said. "Let them tremble," and thus, the boy king began to transform into something far more dangerous. A ruler who not only commanded obedience, but delighted in the power to break those who defied him. At 12, Pepi II was no longer the frightened boy clutching his mother's hand at court. He was Pharaoh now, crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the embodiment of Horus on earth. The coronation had been a spectacle unmatched in recent memory. Priests in white linen carried sacred standards. The air shimmered with incense and desert heat. To the nobles, this boy king was divine, anointed by the gods. To Pepi, it was intoxicating. At first, he sought to rule justly. Guided by his mother, Ankusin Pepi II, he spent hours in the audience hall listening to petitions, nodding solemnly as viziers advised restraint and fairness. The boy still held a kernel of innocence. He enjoyed wandering through the palace gardens, laughing as pet gazelles nibbled figs from his hands. But power is a slow poison, and Pepi's court was full of men eager to exploit it. Whispers began circulating that a pharaoh must be more than a judge. He must be feared. His tutor, a shrewd courtier named Harkuf, warned him that kindness was seen as weakness. "Your enemies are patient," Harkuf said one evening, kneeling beside the boy as torches sputtered. "They will wait until you grow soft. Rule with a smile if you must, but hold a dagger in the other hand." Pepi listened, and something inside him hardened. Soon he was summoning nobles late at night, questioning them about their loyalty. Those who stammered or hesitated were quietly removed from office or worse, found floating in the Nile. The boy king discovered that fear worked faster than diplomacy. He began to enjoy the hush that fell over the throne room when he entered, the way even seasoned generals lowered their eyes. The first sign of something darker came with the punishments. Pepi had been told that justice must be public to remind others of Pharaoh's power. But rather than delegating executions to his guards, he insisted on watching. At first he sat still, face unreadable. Then came the smiles, small, private at first, then openly gleeful. By the time Pepi reached 16, he had transformed his palace into a theater of dread. He ordered feasts that lasted until dawn, filling the hall with dancers and musicians, then abruptly commanded prisoners brought before him. The revelry turned to silence as he passed judgment, delighting in the shifting emotions of his audience: curiosity, fear, relief. Harkuf, once proud of his pupil, began to worry. Pepi's punishments were growing more elaborate, his questions more twisted. He demanded that guards bring him strange animals from Nubia and far-off deserts, not for study, but for spectacle. He forced courtiers to witness brutal hunts in the palace gardens, turning cruelty into entertainment. And yet, outside the palace, Egypt flourished. Trade with Punt and Byblos enriched the treasury. Temples expanded. Foreign rulers sent tribute, hoping to keep the boy god's favor. To the people, this was a golden age. Only those who served close to Pepi saw the shadows gathering, the way the boy's laughter lingered after a man's last scream, the way his eyes gleamed at the sight of blood. What no one yet realized was that Pepi's curiosity had shifted. Power over life and death was no longer enough. He was beginning to crave something stranger, control over pleasure, pain, and the human spirit itself. And the court, eager to keep their god-king amused, would give him anything he asked. By 17, Pepi II's palace had become a world unto itself, a place where the sun seemed afraid to shine too brightly. Marble halls were draped in silks imported from the Levant. Pools were filled with perfumed water, and rare animals roamed freely through courtyards. From the outside, it was paradise. Inside, it was a stage for the pharaoh's obsessions. The nightly feasts grew stranger. Guests were required to wear masks: lion, falcon, crocodile, turning banquets into a surreal masquerade. Musicians played hypnotic rhythms while dancers writhed like spirits possessed. Then Pepi would rise from his throne, smiling as though he held a private joke, and order some new spectacle. 2 prisoners forced to race through the garden while hounds were released behind them. A courtier compelled to drink wine until he collapsed. A servant made to sing while balancing a flame on his palm. At first, the nobles complied out of fear. Then something shifted. The cruelty became fashionable. Courtiers competed to invent ever more bizarre entertainments for their king: gladiatorial matches, grotesque games, elaborate pranks that humiliated rivals. The palace turned into a place where morality bent and finally broke. Pepi reveled in it. He was no longer content to be a spectator. He joined the hunts himself, spearing exotic beasts with unnerving precision. He laughed when blood spattered his linen robes, refusing to change until the feast was over. He began taking lovers from every corner of Egypt: noblewomen, priests, servants, even captured foreigners, then discarding them when they bored him. Rumors swirled that the pharaoh was experimenting with darker pleasures. Harkuf, now an aging man, tried to intervene. One evening he begged Pepi to temper his appetites. A pharaoh must be feared, the tutor said softly, but he must also be loved. You risk losing the hearts of your people. Pepi listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he dismissed Harkuf from court the next morning, sending him to oversee expeditions deep into Nubia, a gilded exile. Those who remained understood the message. There would be no more lectures. Without restraint, Pepi's demands grew wilder. He commanded architects to build secret chambers beneath the palace, rooms lit only by torchlight where he could stage private amusements away from public eyes. Only his most trusted guards and entertainers were allowed to enter. Those who did and failed to please him rarely emerged again. Beyond the palace walls, whispers spread. Merchants spoke of missing children taken for the king's pleasure. Temple priests worried that the pharaoh neglected the gods, skipping rituals in favor of his midnight revels. And yet the Nile still flooded on time, crops still grew, and gold continued to pour into Egypt. Most citizens dared not question their living god. But in the silence of those torchlit chambers, Pepi II's curiosity was mutating into obsession. It was no longer enough to control the body. He wanted to break the mind, to make others laugh, weep, or worship at his command. And soon, the entire court would be drawn into his dark experiments, whether they wished it or not. By 19, Pepi II had turned his palace into something Egypt had never seen. A kingdom within a kingdom, ruled not by law but by his moods. What had once been ceremonial halls now resembled a vast, glittering theater. Every corridor dripped with gold and obsidian, every column wrapped in painted silk, every corner humming with music or whispers of fear. He declared that the court must never sleep. Banquets ran for days, guests collapsing under the weight of wine and exhaustion. Guards carried away the unconscious and replaced them with new arrivals. Nobles who hesitated to attend were stripped of titles, their estates seized. Soon, attendance at the Pharaoh's games was not just expected, it was survival. Pepi's games became legend. One night he would stage a mock trial, accusing courtiers of invented crimes and forcing them to plead for their lives before the entire hall. The next night, he would command them to hunt one another through torchlit corridors, promising riches to the survivor. The line between theater and execution blurred until no one could tell when the performance would turn real. And yet the courtiers learned to smile through their terror. They laughed when Pepi demanded absurdities, forcing them to sing hymns backward, to crawl like lizards across the floor, to kneel and praise him as the moon, the Nile, and the scorpion in one. Those who resisted became the entertainment. The women of the court suffered most. Pepi began choosing his companions at random, sometimes calling entire families into the hall and selecting one to join him, sending the rest away with riches, or to the dungeons. Some women returned days later, hollow-eyed but alive. Others were never seen again. Outside the palace, discontent simmered. Farmers grumbled about heavy taxes. Priests complained that offerings to the gods were being diverted to feed Pepi's endless banquets. But the army remained loyal, well-fed and well-paid, and the Nile continued to flood predictably. Egypt's prosperity masked its king's madness. One evening, during a particularly savage feast, Pepi ordered the palace doors thrown open so that commoners could watch. He wanted the people to see their pharaoh's glory. Villagers and merchants crowded into the hall, awed by the wealth before them, until the games began. They watched as nobles were forced to wrestle wild animals, as prisoners were executed to the rhythm of drums, as Pepi himself laughed and clapped like a delighted child. The spectacle shocked even the onlookers, but it also terrified them. No one left the palace without gifts, gold, grain, jewelry. Yet all returned home whispering that the pharaoh had become something other than human. Within the palace, however, the courtiers had adapted. Fear had twisted into a strange kind of devotion. They competed to invent ever more elaborate spectacles to amuse their king. They smiled even when their lives were at stake, for to disappoint Pepi was death. The boy who had once looked to his mother for guidance was gone. In his place stood a young man who believed he was not merely Pharaoh, but a god who could reshape Egypt in his image. And now his eyes turned outward. The palace games were no longer enough. Pepi wanted all of Egypt to dance to his music, to tremble at his laughter. Pepi II was 21 when he declared that the palace was too small for his vision. Egypt itself, he said, must become the theater of his reign. No longer would his games be confined to gilded halls. The entire kingdom would participate in the spectacle. He began with decrees that turned daily life into ritual. Farmers were ordered to stop work at noon and kneel facing Memphis, chanting hymns to Pepi's glory before resuming their labor. In every village, effigies of the pharaoh were erected, painted in gold leaf with torches burning day and night. Messengers traveled the Nile to enforce these commands, reporting back to Memphis with lists of offenders. Those who failed to participate were summoned to the capital. Some were released after public humiliation, forced to dance naked in the courtyard until they collapsed from exhaustion, while others were never seen again. Rumors spread of dungeons beneath the palace where screams echoed for hours, but no one dared speak of it openly. Pepi staged colossal festivals in the desert, summoning thousands of villagers to witness reenactments of Egypt's creation myth, with himself as Ra, the sun god, descending in a golden chariot. Hundreds of slaves carried him across sand dunes under the blazing sun, their skin blistered, their lips cracking. Priests begged him to limit the extravagance, but Pepi silenced them by replacing the high priest of Ptah with a favorite court jester, declaring that laughter pleases the gods more than incense. Soon his appetite for control turned darker. He began sending his guards to distant nomes, provinces to collect young boys and girls for his holy processions. Some were paraded through the streets dressed as divine attendants. Others vanished into the palace's inner chambers. Mothers wept on the riverbanks as the barges departed, powerless to resist. Yet Pepi believed he was loved. To him, the tears of his subjects were proof of their awe, the trembling of the priests proof of their devotion. He ordered sculptors to carve scenes of these festivals into temple walls, villagers kneeling, priests bowing, slaves carrying his throne, each image depicting him larger than life, towering over them like a god. In the countryside, resentment turned into quiet rebellion. Farmers began hiding grain, refusing to send their full harvests. Village elders bribed messengers to avoid reporting minor infractions. Some remote regions simply stopped obeying the noon prayers altogether. But Pepi's spies were everywhere, and each act of defiance was punished tenfold. The court, meanwhile, had descended into madness. Nobles competed to invent new spectacles for the pharaoh. Fire dancers, human pyramids, contests of pain where men stood motionless in the sun until they fainted. Those who failed to impress were fed to the crocodiles in the palace lake. One night, during a festival on the banks of the Nile, a young courtier whispered to Pepi that a certain province had refused to send tribute. Pepi's face lit with a strange joy. Rather than send soldiers to crush them, he announced that the entire court would travel there, to bring the spectacle to the disobedient province personally. The idea electrified him. Egypt would no longer just watch his games, Egypt would become the game. As the court prepared to leave Memphis, a strange hush settled over the city. Citizens lined the streets, watching the golden barges float down the Nile, their oars glinting in the moonlight. Some prayed for the pharaoh's safe journey. Others prayed that he would never return. The flotilla of golden barges arrived at the rebellious province under the dying light of dusk. The setting sun bathed the Nile in crimson, as though the river itself foresaw what was to come. Pepi II stood at the prow, dressed in gold so polished it caught the last rays like fire, his face painted with black coal and red ochre. His courtiers stood behind him in ceremonial silence, their smiles stiff and nervous. The villagers had been gathered in the central square under guard. They knelt in rows, heads pressed to the sand, while the priests of the province stood apart, grim-faced, awaiting judgment. Pepi stepped ashore barefoot, letting the dust cling to his feet, as though to remind them that even the earth bowed before him. He ordered silence. Then, in a voice that carried through the square, he declared that this night would be a night of rebirth. The province would either submit to his divine will or be erased from history. At his signal, torches were lit until the entire square glowed like a furnace. The villagers were divided into groups, men on one side, women and children on the other, and forced to watch as Pepi's court began its spectacle. Drummers beat a slow, ominous rhythm. Dancers painted in gold and blood whirled around the square, their movements wild, frenzied as though possessed. Then came the trials. One by one, the village elders were brought forward and accused of treason. Some tried to protest their innocence, but Pepi silenced them with a gesture. "Your words are dust," he said. "Let your fear speak for you." He ordered them to perform acts of submission, crawling across burning coals, kneeling in the dust to kiss his feet, swearing oaths under pain of death. Those who faltered were dragged away to the edge of the square. From somewhere in the shadows came the sound of iron chains, the smell of smoke. The crowd began to weep quietly, but no one dared resist. Mothers clutched their children, soldiers kept their spears leveled. The drums grew faster. At the height of the night, Pepi called for the dance of the crocodile. A pit had been dug near the river, filled with water and several half-starved crocodiles captured for the occasion. Prisoners were forced to dance at the pit's edge, their feet slipping on the wet earth. Each time one stumbled too close, the crowd screamed, half in terror, half in awe. When one man finally fell in, the water erupted in a frenzy. Pepi threw back his head and laughed, the sound sharp and high like a child's delight. By dawn, the square was silent except for the sobbing of the survivors. The elders who had passed Pepi's tests were allowed to live but stripped of authority. In their place, Pepi installed young men from his own court, outsiders loyal only to him. Before leaving, he ordered a stone stele erected in the center of the square. It showed Pepi towering over kneeling villagers, one hand raised in blessing, the other holding a whip. Beneath the image were the words, "Those who defy the son of Ra shall be reborn in fear." When the flotilla departed, the province was a ghostly place. Its people had been broken, its leaders replaced, its children taken to Memphis as gifts. But to Pepi, the night had been a triumph. He had not merely punished rebellion, he had turned it into art. As the barges glided down the Nile, Pepi watched the sunrise with a smile. He whispered to his attendants, "Now Egypt knows who rules, and this is only the beginning." Behind him, the courtiers shivered, though the morning was warm. They knew that Pepi's appetite for spectacle had only grown, and soon, no corner of Egypt would be safe from his theater of terror. Years passed, and Pepi II's reign stretched unnaturally long. His hair, once black and lustrous, turned the color of sand. His eyes, though, remained bright, too bright, burning with the same feverish delight that had terrified Egypt for decades. But the court was not what it had once been. Many of the original courtiers were gone. Some executed, some vanished into dungeons, others dead from sheer exhaustion of living under Pepi's rule. Those who remained smiled only when watched, whispered only when sure no one could hear. Egypt itself had begun to rot. The Nile's floods became unpredictable. Famine struck in certain provinces, and the once stable network of farms and granaries faltered. Tribute shipments slowed. Villages emptied as people fled into the desert or upriver, seeking refuge from the endless demands of the crown. Pepi's response was to double down. He staged even grander spectacles, as though he could frighten Egypt back to life. He filled the palace with dancers, jesters, even wild beasts, forcing them to perform night after night. He commanded massive processions through the streets, demanding that every man, woman, and child line the roads to cheer his passage. But the cheers grew thin. Where once the crowds had been packed and desperate to please, now there were gaps, empty spaces where no one came. Pepi noticed, and rage filled him. He ordered entire villages burned for failing to send enough celebrants. His guards dragged prisoners through the capital, displaying them as warnings. The priests, long humiliated, began to plot. The generals, whose loyalty had been purchased with feasts and gold, now found their armies starving. One by one, they began to turn against him. The final blow came one night during what was meant to be Pepi's most magnificent performance. The palace was lit with 1,000 torches. The court gathered in trembling anticipation. Pepi sat on his golden throne wearing a headdress so heavy it bowed his neck. He announced that tonight would be the night of eternal glory, a ritual that would ensure his name lived forever. But as the ritual began, something was wrong. The guards stationed at the hall's entrance did not return. The music faltered. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then the torches began to go out, one by one, as though the darkness itself was reclaiming the palace. By the time Pepi realized what was happening, it was too late. The priests and generals had surrounded the palace, cutting off escape. The court panicked, some fleeing into the shadows, others falling to their knees. Pepi stood, roaring his fury, ordering his guards to fight. But many of them had already joined the rebellion. They did not kill him outright. Pepi was too sacred, too dangerous to strike down publicly. Instead, they locked him in his own throne room, sealing the doors with stone. His food was delivered once a day. No more banquets, no more music. The court dispersed, the games ended, days turned into weeks. Alone in the vast echoing chamber, Pepi raged, then wept, then laughed. He performed plays for invisible audiences, sang to the statues of the gods, recited his own praises until his voice cracked. His once golden throne tarnished, his robes fell to rags, his body withered. When they finally opened the doors months later, they found him seated upright on the throne, his back straight, his face still painted in faded coal. His lips were curled in a smile as though he had died mid-laugh. Egypt did not mourn him. His name was struck from some temple walls, left to fade from memory. But in certain villages, when the Nile ran red at sunset, the old ones whispered that Pepi still laughed somewhere, demanding that Egypt dance for him one last time. And so ended the reign of the Pharaoh who turned an empire into his stage, leaving behind a kingdom forever haunted by the memory of his madness.